Welcome to the Africa Youth Climate Assembly Stories. Today we are joined by my good friend, Professor Jean-Pascal, who is an academic climatologist and also a former IPCC vice chairperson. And he will tell us more about himself and the work that he does. Welcome, Professor.
Well, I'm a physicist. I've been working on climate change for more than 40 years now, doing research on climate change, teaching, lecturing, and also participating in IPCC, the IPCC work. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN body advising the international community about the science of the different aspects of climate change, the facts, but also adaptation, mitigation, and all the solutions that are there to be used. I also attended and participated as a science advisor to all the COPs. I only missed 2 COPs on the entire series, so I know well the science policy interface. And I'd like to put now that long experience and that interest I have also for the connection between climate change issues and development issues and other sustainable development issues as well. I always wear this pin here with the logo of the SDGs at the service of the international community by trying to become and to be elected chair of the IPCC. And it's a one country, one vote election, so I need to convince many countries to vote for my candidacy.
Yeah. At the moment, as we speak, we have a number of youths from across the African continent that are putting together the Africa Youth Climate Assembly that is in alignment with the Africa Climate Summit that is coming up in September, hosted by the government of Kenya and also the AU here in Nairobi. And for us, this is an assembly that presents a wonderful opportunity for meaningful and genuine youth engagement, bringing together young voices from across Africa to articulate what we want the UNFCCC process ahead of COP28 to deliver, and of course to ensure justice for the most vulnerable communities and to also unlock finance for just transition and adaptation. What do you have to say about that?
The role of meetings like the one you are organizing is very important to put people in front of their responsibilities, particularly, not only, but particularly those in the north, because the developed countries, and I'm coming from a developed country, I'm very aware of our responsibility. Developed countries have emitted most of greenhouse gases, and they need to be put in front of their responsibilities, and what the young people can do very eloquently usually is precisely that. So your work is very important to help move things because we need much more action. And the role of youth to mobilize political will and energy to change things, to leave the status quo is extremely important.
Yeah, great. And speaking of climate justice, you have highlighted that it's important that all perspectives are brought to the conversations. So how do you think the IPCC will best center the voices of African scientists, or how can the IPCC best do that? Because I think at the moment it's been quite a challenge. So how can it best be?
One has to recognize there's been a progress over the last few years in the way developing country scientists and African scientists in particular have been involved in the authorship of IPCC, but we can still go much further. And my intention is to have in the next assessment cycle of the IPCC the most inclusive IPCC ever. And among other things, it means involving more African scientists in the process, African authors in the authors. It also means involving more women in the authorship, because they are half of humanity, but they're not half of the authorship yet. It also means involving more young and early career scientists, and there are many of them in Africa. It also means looking at literature published in other languages than English. Of course, English is very important, but there is interesting literature in French and other languages. And we also need, and that's also important in Africa and very important for inclusivity, to look at the traditional knowledge, the knowledge from local communities, indigenous communities, because they know so well how to live in a viable climate, and it can help significantly to be more resilient in the future.
Let's talk a little bit more about the upcoming elections for the IPCC's new chair, and which you're running for. You've just mentioned that to us. If you can briefly tell us about it and what your vision is once elected as chair, especially with the issue of underrepresentation of African scientists and others. Do you have any plans of changing the status quo?
Yes. Yeah, I'm full of energy, and I would like first to make sure the IPCC is recognized as the global voice for everything related to climate change from a scientific point of view. And when I say a scientific point of view, it's very broad. It's not only the physics of climate change, but it goes to financing and adaptation and all those other issues as well. Second, I want to make sure that the IPCC provides the most useful, the most relevant information to decision makers, to policy makers of the world. And for that, we need to have a good dialogue between the two communities. And third, we need to do all of that, number one and number two, a global voice and the best connection between science and the needs of decision makers in the most inclusive way. And the most inclusive way means increasing the participation of developing countries and, of course, African scientists in particular in the authorship of the IPCC, because the IPCC is a global body. And to have its reports fully representative and representing the concerns, the realities on the ground in all countries on the world, particularly in those who are the most affected by climate change, it is absolutely essential to have scientists, including, of course, young scientists, from those regions, from those countries, because they know the best what is happening. And I really plan to increase the percentage of authors from Africa and from developing countries, but also I have plans to try to support them so that they have, for example, the same access to scientific information than their counterparts in developed countries, which is not always the case. They sometimes have difficulties to, access the usually expensive subscriptions to scientific magazines and that kind of things. And if elected, I will really continue to search, because I started already, funding to change that situation so that they work and that they can work in better conditions in the IPCC. So I'm trying to find already now funding so that those scientists from developing countries and African scientists in particular would work in better conditions on the same level as their developed country counterparts in IPCC to do the best possible work so that their concerns, their knowledge can be best reflected in the IPCC reports of the future.